Today on Keep Classical Weird, we delve into a conversation about playing in tune. With instrumentalists like me and Dr. Tegart, this inevitably dissolves into frustration for any musician who doesn't have to deal with it. I almost titled this episode, Piano Players Are the Worst.
And when you're like trying to tune with the piano and they keep hitting it and they're like trying to get you to play in tune or they think it's out of tune, I just want to hit him and be like, "No. Don't even start with me."
Welcome, friends, to episode 45 of Keep Classical Weird. I am your host, Casey Bozell, and today we're exploring different methods of tuning. Now, if you're a musician or you have a musician as a loved one in your life, you've no doubt heard complaints about getting things in tune. Dr. Sophia Tegart and I have a really in-depth discussion about different systems of tuning, the harmonic series, and why every musician we know today struggles with intonation, except pianists. Now, just a quick note. In order to have an audio example of some of the things we talk about on the episode, I recorded samples of piano, violin, and flute. And I want to make it very clear that it is me playing the flute, not Dr. Tegart. In hindsight, I should have asked her. She would have sounded worlds better. Anyway, I hope you have as much fun as we did nerding out about intonation. Enjoy. So I have been learning violin. I still consider myself learning violin. I'm still like understanding how this instrument works for nearly 30 years. And there are days where I still can't play it in tune, which I think everybody sympathizes with, but also it really frustrates me that I can play in tune in some situations, but that doesn't mean it'll be in tune in other situations. And that's always made me want to throw my case across the room. So can you why do we do this to ourselves?
Okay, so yes, I've been thinking about this because when you said you wanted to talk about tuning systems and that kind of stuff, I was like, well, that's a huge topic because it's so open-ended. I mean, there are so many different ways that people tune. I mean, you go from one orchestra to the next, even within the United States, and they're tuning to a different pitch. Um, it creates issues on our instruments because our instruments are built a certain way, right? I was thinking about this and I was reading up on tuning and temperaments and all of this stuff, and what I came to realize was that this struggle with playing in tune has been going on for centuries. And the only reason why we might feel worse about it now is because things are easier to define because of technology. So we can actually measure if we're in tune or out of tune precisely using, equipment. Whereas 400 years ago, that was definitely not possible. And pitch centers varied from city to city. And it's so just like this cloud of chaotic tuning floating around in the atmosphere, and the only reason why we think more about it now is because we actually have machines that are saying no, you're out of tune, you know.
So it's very possible people have been hitting clams since the beginning of time.
Yeah,
And we just actually have like definitive scientific proof that they're doing it now.
yeah, yeah, and it's hard to tell, where the pitch centers were back then because again, there's no way of deciphering, exactly what pitch they were playing at, and people argue about this all the time, then we've said, oh well, in France, during this time period, they were playing really low, like their A's sounded like A flats or even G's or something. And but at the same time, in Venice it was a higher pitch, and so I mean it just varied from place to place. I guess I'm just thankful now that at least we're mostly in the same area.
Right.
Like, oh, I feel you. Like tuning is always so stressful, you know, and I'm so shocked to hear a string player say that, because I always feel like when I listen to little kids play violin versus little kids playing the flute, violin just is so much more in tune than like little kid flute players. They sound awful, you know?
Well, yeah, there's the whole concept of that flutes have keys,
Mm-hmm.
which when you're a kid, those function kind of like buttons.
Yep.
Like if I press these buttons, this note comes out, and the
Mm-hmm.
the subtleties and the strength of your embouchure, and the different things you can do with your lips, and therefore what you have to do with your ear training, that seems to me to come later,
Mm-hmm.
because you need so much like tiny minute control,
Yeah.
um whereas, which I mean we do too, but if you get a kid that can't, like, that consistently plays between a C natural and a C sharp all the time,
Mm-hmm.
then you got to fix that.
Right. Right. But I think you also make a good point where I think that training starts to come earlier. Like you said on flute, you play a key or you push a button and the note comes out. It might be god awful out of tune, but it comes out within the vicinity of that pitch.
Mhm.
And so I always think of string players as having so much, like like it is harder for you guys to, like, get that down, but once you get it down I feel like, oh wow, that's so impressive. I still have flute players who are just pressing a button and they're still like half a step sharp or something. It's shocking.
That's amazing, because that's something I would wager a guess that string players have. Well, I guess I was going to say an above average, but I guess I don't know. We have a crazy amount of stress and anxiety over our intonation all the time. And maybe it's because from day one, it's been like, don't be out of tune. And, you could put tapes on the violin and be like, okay, put your fingers on the tapes and they'll probably be right. But then some days they won't.
Yeah.
So that's insane. So that's why piano players are the worst.
Agreed, they are
Because
the
they never
worst.
have to. Yeah.
And when you're like trying to tune with the piano and they keep hitting it and they're like trying to get you to play in tune, or they think it's out of tune, I just want to hit him and be like, no, don't even start with me. You have preset pitches, and that's another reason why it's hard to play in tune, because when you're playing with piano it's equal temperament. I mean, every single half step sounds exactly the same. But when you play with like maybe another string group or other instruments that are not specifically like that, they'll start tuning more to the more pure intervals.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Mm-hmm.
like we have to be able to adjust to the instruments that are obstinate and don't bend in any way. They're they're difficult instruments.
They're so difficult. Let's talk about that exactly. Okay, equal temperaments. Here's
Yeah.
what we got. It's so we got what, 12 half steps
Mm-hmm.
in an octave. And when you're talking about equal temperament, which is what modern pianos are tuned to,
Yeah.
every single half step mathematically in that octave is the same distance apart from one another.
Right.
um which, if you just said that out of context, if somebody didn't have any idea of like what we were talking about with tuning, I feel like if they heard that they'd be like, well, duh, why wouldn't every half step be the same amount? Except that's not true of other instruments. So talk about what you mean by like pure intervals and stuff.
Okay, so when you listen to a piano play like a C and an E together, right? That's a third. And on an equal temperament piano, it's going to sound slightly out of tune because the third is going to be a little too wide, right? And so um equally, if you play the C and a G, which is a fifth, that interval is going to be a little too small, and so it sounds slightly out of tune. Like you can hear little tiny waves or beats when you listen to those two. But when you tune to like a pure interval, you actually have to adjust. You have to temper each note until it kind of locks into that place where it's just ringing together and there's no extra little beats or waves in there, and it just sounds pure. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And like if you look at the waveforms of an equal temperament interval versus a pure interval, you'll see the waves um, look totally different, right? And so the pure intervals allow for these beautifully, locked in pitches that sound simultaneously, but you can't do that all the time, because if you always tune pure fifths up the sequence, you'll end up getting to a point where the same note name will be a different pitch. That in itself causes issues for, violin, for flute, for instruments that are not just set. We have to be able to jump back and forth between equal temperament and those just intonation, essentially, at any given time. And I think maybe that's why our ears will malfunction once in a while. We might be playing a certain way, and then suddenly we have to, switch gears. So like when I'm playing with my wind quintet, we're going to tune intervals, and there might be more of a just intonation approach to that. And then if the next day I have to play a piece with a piano, it's like a totally different ear set. That might be why we have those momentary freakouts with our ears. Just, it's like our eardrums, throw their arms up in the air and they're like, I'm out, I'm done, I can't.
Well, that's a weird brain thing that happens too, is that if you're practicing and you play a note out of tune several times in a row, your brain will start to hear that as in tune. Mm-hmm. So that messes you up. So that, all the classical musicians I know have this set of purposeful, perpetual insecurity about where their pitch is, because they know if they stop being super diligent and attentive, their ears will not be as well trained. So it's this, everything else becomes habitual about the instrument with with your posture and your note reading and everything, but actual like clarity and adjustment of intonation, if you let that become habitual, it'll be wrong eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that goes to show, also, like, people who have perfect pitch and can hear, not just that it's an A or a B flat or whatever, but they can hear like how flat or sharp it is just perfectly. Sometimes they're so stuck in that they can't actually adjust when they're playing with a group that's maybe out of tune, right? And
Right.
So then they're the ones who sound out of tune. So it's all relative. It's all relative to where you are. I don't know. I'm thankful I don't have perfect pitch. Oh, I really am. I really am, because um I like being able to adjust without it like hurting my inner soul.
That's very true and very important. And it's like you said, if I'm performing with a string orchestra or a string quartet or something like that, and then that a couple days later I go with my piano trio, I still remember there's this one note at the end of the Mendelssohn D minor piano trio. Yeah. And it's a fourth on my interval. It's an F and a C. I could play that in tune by myself all day long. And I could also play that in tune with the cello note, which I don't remember what that is at this point, all day long. But as soon as you put the piano chord in there, it's impossible for me to be in tune. And I ended up during performances with it, like playing really into the F because I was like more sure of where that was, and kind of like just laying off the C and giving just like an impression of the C, and like it's there, but I don't want you to listen too carefully to it because it just clashed with the piano so much.
Really, I think what this chat should be about is why the piano is so troublesome.
I think so. Okay, let's pivot. Let's pivot to piano hate right now. Why do we hate pianos?
No, so, I love pianists.
I do too. I do too. I'm just they're that's the jerk instrument that always has to be right, but they're great. So, all right. So we've got a couple systems of tuning. We talked about equal temperament, which is what pianos are on. And you touched on just intonation. A lot of string players, I think, kind of go under that umbrella when they're playing, I guess, unaccompanied, like with themselves. Would you be able to go into just intonation?
Yeah, I mean, just intonation is where you're gonna alter the intervals to be part of the harmonic series that of each pitch. So like that's why they're pure intervals. They're intervals that show up within the harmonic series, meaning like for me as a flutist, if I play a low C and I overblow the note, it'll go up an octave, 8 pitches, and then if I overblow it again, it'll go up a fifth, and then it'll go up to the second octave, and then a third, and it goes through all these notes within a chord. And all of the way those notes sound is kind of the pure interval and where those notes should fit. So that's as best as I can kind of explain it. It's the purest form of intervals locking in, and it's probably the most related to like Pythagoras's tuning, which divides the octave on ratios, and it's very precise mathematically. But again, it leads to that issue of you go up so high, eventually that top note is not really the same pitch, if you came back around. It's pure until it's incredibly not.
so it's a mathematical series really based on a certain key, like or actually based on a note. It's a specific pitch it's based off of.
It's a note and the intervals. So like within an octave, it's just the way you would move with the bigger intervals within that.
Okay, so like you were talking about, let's say you're playing a C on your flute. And then, so if you're playing like middle C, you overblow, like you said, and the next pitch to come out would be the next highest C. And then, and this is keeping all your fingers in the same place?
Same place.
Okay, so same orientation of your fingers. And then if you overblow more,
next pitch that you can get is a fifth above that second pitch.
Okay, so a G above.
So a G, yeah.
That's okay.
Above. And then the next pitch would be a C, and then the next pitch would be an E, and then a G, and then a B flat. Get a little seventh in there.
It gets a little dominant seventh-y. That's awesome.
Those are the intervals. Like those are the important intervals. So I mean, I'm just talking about like you can have other intervals in that system. It's just those are the ones that if you follow those and go from pure note to pure note to pure note, it'll eventually end up getting to a not pure note. So
Right, because it's mathematically what will come next, like acoustically speaking.
I don't know. I look at it as like a building blocks temperament. You know, it builds on itself, and each build is set so that it's like a really pure, like, again, so if now that we have technology, you can see the wavelengths, and they lock in, and so it's just really pretty building blocks until it comes tumbling down, kind of like a Jenga tower, you know?
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty
You keep
building
taking one
blocks.
from the
I like
bottom
it.
and building it up, and then it gets to the point where it just can't handle it anymore, and that's when you get the note that's it just doesn't fit.
Bach wrote a number of works for the well-tempered clavier.
Yes. So I think the best way to understand that is to understand the tuning system that was dominating before, like, a well-tempered or an irregular temperament kind of came into play. So, like, in the Renaissance era and going into, the Baroque era, there was a system called the mean tone system, right? So some they would use those pure intervals like we saw in like in a just intonation temperament. So you'd have like these pure thirds and pure fifths and whatever. And what that would do is somehow, and this is where things get a little dicey and I don't really comprehend, but somehow, because you're using pure thirds and pure fifths, and you have an instrument, let's say like the harpsichord or something that needs to be set, right? They tune it and make it work so that it fits certain keys, um, which it'll sound pretty good in that way. But then if you have any kind of pitch that isn't in that key, it sounds completely out. So what I guess the best way of thinking with mean tone is, um, you have, let's say, a B flat major scale ish in mean tone, and you have these beautiful thirds and these beautiful fifths. But if a composer were to suddenly put a D sharp in there, which is not in the key of B flat major, the D sharp will not be the same pitch as the E flat. And like, I think to a flutist this makes sense, because in the flutes that came at the very early stages of the Baroque period, a lot of them had both a D sharp key and an E flat key, and the pitch was slightly different.
No kidding.
Yeah. So
I
to
didn't know
me,
that.
this makes sense, like, oh, if I'm playing in E major, of course I'm going to use the D sharp key. And if I'm playing in E flat major, of course I'm going to use the E flat key, for those early flutes. So in that sense, it makes total logical sense, but so what that means is, playing in one key might sound great, and playing in another key, it's going to sound awful. Like, you could never play something in E major on a keyboard that has been tuned to allow E flat major to sound good, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So there's all these like silly little things that happen then. So the well-tempered clavier that Bach wrote is just, um, it's in a temperament that allows those, like the E flat and the D sharp, it's like compromised so that you can use both of those notes at any time within any key. So
Oh,
I look at
okay.
the well-tempered clavier as being like compromised, not in a bad way. It's not like Bach was compromised, like it's more like it's more like it's a compromise of how to do that. And I think as we both know, when you're playing with other people, you end up compromising on pitch all the time anyway. So I think compromising is the key word that Bach taught us.
Right. Oh,
You
that's
know.
interesting.
Yeah.
So I learned that kind of brings up a different facet. So when I play in D flat major, which is not a friendly key for the violin, if I play in D flat major, I'm going to conceptualize that and I think tune it differently than I would if I was doing C sharp major, even though that's the exact same keys on a keyboard. Like if you're given a D flat major and C sharp major, and then on a keyboard though, it might just be because of the way that people compose or conceptualize it. I swear those keys sound different. D flat major and C sharp major.
Yes. Okay. So I'm glad you brought this up because there is an entire book by this musicologist, Rita Stublin, and it's all about key characteristics of the 17th and 18th centuries. And it is the nerdiest book on the face of the planet, and I absolutely love it. I adore it. It is one of my go-to books when I'm like just researching stuff from those two centuries. And Rita Stublin essentially talks about how not only were the key centers different in all of these places, but how they viewed every key signature was different. So like, and I don't have the book memorized, so I'm just making this up. But let's say C major in France would be a little darker, maybe, whereas C major in Venice would be super bright and happy, you know?
Whoa.
So like, yes, C major is still maybe happy in France, but it's not as dark, and that might be because the pitch center was lower. Who knows? But like, you know, you look at these different places, they have different pitch settings, they have different tunings, and part of it's related. I mean, like, you can totally go off on a tangent on how much stuff is affecting pitch. You know, Venice was clearly really warm like all the time, and so pitch is going to be higher for some instruments, maybe lower for others. And then you have like northern Germany where it's colder, the pitch center might be lower as well. So I mean, there's like all these contributing factors. And then you have different places with different pitch centers because of that. And then they are hearing the keys differently. So yes, C sharp major to me always sounds brighter than D flat major.
Yeah.
Right? And that might just simply be a result of just the way we've learned these keys and we've been hearing things differently. And it might be the way the key is, you know, made up, and especially on the piano, because it's equal temperament, you know, it's gonna sound different. There's so many things that like can just mess with your brain when you're thinking about this, that it's no wonder we can't play in tune. Like, it's like, what you could do is like, if anyone ever says, you know, your C is, it's a little high, you can say, well, I'm playing in 17th century Venetian temperament.
Yeah, Venetian Cs are high. Thanks. And that's our show for today. Our theme music was composed by not dead composer Thomas Barber. Check out his stuff at thomasbarber.com. Web development support is provided by Tina at citybeautifuldesign.com. Keep Classical Weird is created and edited by me, Casey Bozell. Find us on Facebook and Instagram, and please feel free to reach out to me directly at keepclassicalweird@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Stay safe and stay weird.